Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Recent reports show us that Greenland's glaciers are melting at an increasingly alarming pace. While climate change and warming air temperatures are a part of the problem, there's another culprit attacking these glaciers from below. And the fans of Generation Tech know exactly who's behind all of this. There's no other species on Earth that benefits more from the rising sea levels than dolphins. So do your part in fighting climate change by driving an electric car and also eating dolphin-unsafe tuna. The more you know. You ever wonder why in a world full of star destroyers and turbolasers there still are ground forces and infantry units fighting massive siege battles on the ground? An Imperial-class star destroyer has over 60 heavy turbolasers that can send terrifying amounts of fire and destruction from orbit onto any location on a planet's surface within seconds. It's not like the Empire really hesitated when it came to destroying planets or massacring entire populations. So why don't we see more orbital bombardment in Star Wars? Well, first, for this to work, let's forget that the Empire destroyed Alderaan, shattered Jeddah, and then glassed their own garrison on Scarif. At least before the rebels began posing a serious threat to the Empire, the Emperor was relatively benign and the Empire represented stability and order. The main weapon used for orbital bombardment in Star Wars is a turbolaser. These are basically scaled up versions of a blaster. This is how they work. A particle beam is generated. This is a stream of usually charged atomic matter moving at nearly light speed. This particle beam is then guided through a stream of energized turbonic gas, a very compact and dense gas that turns into a plasma-like projectile. These bolts of superheated gas and atomic matter create a huge amount of kinetic damage and can burn through multiple layers of metal and superheat the surrounding areas. These were weapons designed to take down enormous several hundred-meter long starships, oftentimes equipped with several meters of armor, along with deflector shields. Using such weapons on surface targets would cause a devastating amount of damage. For instance, in Legends, during the Second Galactic Civil War during the Battle of Kashyyyk, when the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances began opening fire with long-range turbolasers onto the forested planet of Kashyyyk, massive amounts of the planet's surface quickly caught on fire and caused almost irreversible damage. Kashyyyk's jungles were a rarity in the galaxy and had resources that were hard to find anywhere else, including various types of medicines and exotic animals, along with warshare wood, one of the toughest organic materials in the galaxy. There might be billions of worlds in the galaxy, but only a handful of them were habitable and had really exotic resources like Kashyyyk. Darth Caedus, who had ordered the strike on Kashyyyk, was kind of an evil twat. But the Empire, at least in the earlier days, was far more logical and concerned with preserving worlds like Kashyyyk because it turns out that the Wookiees who lived on the planet were incredibly useful as manual labor slaves. So I guess the lesson here is that the Empire viewed orbital bombardment as an evil and wasteful thing because it could potentially destroy the breeding ground of a very useful species that also happened to make really good slaves. Okay, I can see how that's kind of wrong, but let's continue. So an example of what happens to a world after extensive amounts of orbital bombardment would be Tatooine. More than 25,000 years ago, Tatooine was a lush jungle world with massive oceans. It was populated by the advanced species known as the Kumamga. During this time period, a species known as the Rakatans were on the rise and dominated most of the core region of the galaxy. They were complete degenerates and cannibals and used dark side magic to power their vehicles and technology. Their entire species actually had a racial affinity for the dark side. So it's not racist or stereotyping for me to call them scumbags, it's science. Anyway, the Rakatan Infinite Empire invaded the planet of Tatooine and then subjugated the local population. But when the locals rebelled, they bombarded their planet into submission. Well, actually, the term used by historians here is glass. The constant stream of thermal energy boiled away the oceans, killing all the dolphins. The radioactive particles ripped a hole through the atmosphere, which helped vent all the moisture and gas away from the planet. And then the soil was fused by the extreme heat and turned into sand. The Kumamga were more or less killed off and eventually devolved into Jawas. More importantly, the Rakans can no longer use the planet to produce agricultural goods and breed slaves, which brings me to the conclusion that orbital bombardment is actually good and can prevent slavery. There are also rumors that the Kumamga's excessive industrial production emissions caused the climate to change, and that the Rakatans were used as scapegoats by the Kumamga's oil industry and were actually really nice and completely not cannibals. So orbital bombardment clearly has some effect on the local environment and also slavery. But precision turbolaser fire from orbit that didn't involve turning the planet into glass was commonly used by Imperial forces. The Imperial Star Destroyer was in many ways a forward operating base and also used as an artillery station. Forward observers on the ground could designate enemy targets and call down turbolaser fire to completely devastate enemy fortifications. Again, I'm surprised we don't see this more in Star Wars film. Why are there so many infantry battles? This definitely would have been a useful tactic during the trench warfare on Mim Bomb, for instance. But one of the reasons why we don't see this more often is that the average Imperial ship's turbolaser doesn't actually work that well when it encounters atmosphere. For one, turbolaser bolts, as we described, are made out of particles and plasma. Most planets that have life on them will also have dense enough atmospheres and electromagnetospheres to protect life from radiation and also keep gases from escaping into vacuum. This atmosphere is usually several miles thick and will slowly eat away at any incoming plasma bolt. To make matters worse, because these turbolaser bolts disperse when they hit atmosphere, they might also veer off target and become increasingly inaccurate the further they travel through atmosphere. The increased likelihood of friendly fire is why Star Destroyers are not used for close air support, which is also why orbital bombardment usually were used to target entire cities rather than individual units or small areas. And believe it or not, the Empire would hesitate on destroying a very productive city that had millions of Imperial citizens living in it. So for most starships to use their turbolasers in atmosphere, they would actually have to venture down into the stratosphere of a planet before their weapons become more efficient. And not every ship had powerful enough repulsors to allow it to fly within a planet's gravity well. When the Venator-class Star Destroyer was designed, it was considered the largest ship capable of landing and taking off in atmosphere. Later on, ships like the Imperial-class Star Destroyer could kind of do the same, but this kind of maneuver was extremely taxing on a Star Destroyer's repulsor. Oftentimes, the reactor had to be turned to unsafe temperatures to keep a ship in low orbit. Firing massive barrages of turbolaser fire at the ground would soak up the remaining energy in the generator, which usually meant that deflector shields were turned off during this maneuver. And while these large ships are fighting a planet's gravity, they aren't really able to maneuver very quickly and are essentially giant mile-long targets hanging in the sky. Without their shields activated, this made them very easy targets for ground-based air defenses or enemy fighters and fleets. An Imperial-class Star Destroyer could only really deploy in the stratosphere when it had a really large escort fleet or if all enemy forces are defeated already. If any damage is done to a ship at these lower altitudes, especially damage to the engines or reactors, the ship might not have enough power to be able to recover and crash onto the surface. And even if you are in the stratosphere, turbolaser bolts still had to travel anywhere from 5 to 10 miles, which meant they still weren't all that powerful or accurate. There are several ways that you could defend your planet from orbital bombardment. One is obviously by deploying a fleet and using starfighters to keep these ships from entering your orbit. The second would be a planetary or a theater shield. These gigantic shield barriers were powered by generators placed on the ground, which were far more powerful than the ones found on ships. These were basically impenetrable, as the rebels found out during the Battle of Scarif, and then again at the Battle of Endor. The rebels also used smaller versions of a planetary shield known as theater shields, which they used during the Battle of Hoth. This is why Vader's massive fleet, which included a Super Star Destroyer, had to rely on ground forces to take down Echo Base's shield generator. These shields were designed to stop anything moving at high speeds, but someone slowly lumbering along in, say, an AT-AT, in theory should be able to pass. The theater shields used by the rebels on Chopper Base was a prototype one and wasn't as powerful and was quickly overwhelmed by Thrawn's orbital bombardment. The First Order would later on design the Manator 4 class siege dreadnought, which featured two massive orbital autocannons designed specifically for knocking out these type of shields. For the Galactic Empire, training and outfitting an infantry unit was relatively cheap compared to the price of losing one Imperial-class Star Destroyer. As we've mentioned before, placing an Imperial-class Star Destroyer in orbit is very dangerous. And more importantly, most Imperial officers sought glory in one way or another.
Just over that last ridge! Victory!
And there's no better way to advancing your career as an infantry officer than leading a ground attack against an enemy fortification. When the Imperial-class Star Destroyer Relentless approached the planet of Selos, home to a small cell of old Republic clone troopers, Admiral Constantine suggested on bombarding the clones from orbit. Most of the planet was uninhabited, and there would only be a minimum amount of damage to the local environment. But Imperial Security Bureau agent Callus wanted to proceed with a ground invasion and proceeded to engage the clones on foot. Admiral Callus really liked engaging his enemies face to face. He would occasionally even duel rebels with melee weapons. Orbital bombardment was just not his thing, and I guess that's alright. During the Battle of Chopper Base, Admiral Thrawn, who in many ways was one of the most logical and emotionless commanders the galaxy has ever seen, halts the planetary bombardment just before the shields are collapsed and then proceeds to lead a ground attack. One of the reasons why Thrawn did this was because he probably wanted survivors. The Rebel Alliance at the time functioned as a loose coalition of loosely connected cells. It was very difficult to get the rebels to give up any information on these cells, so having prisoners was very important. An orbital bombardment significantly reduces the amount of survivors you can interrogate. So those are just a few reasons why orbital bombardment is not used more often in Star Wars. As you can see, it's probably one of the best ways to eradicate slavery. So I guess I am pro orbital bombardment. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.